All right, round two. This is part two of the Rhetoric of Science. Part one, we covered the notion of science as objective. And from that perspective, science is non-rhetorical. It basically doesn't involve rhetoric whatsoever. In the second section of this discussion about science and rhetoric, I want to propose to you a different notion of science, which is science as a discipline. Now, science as a discipline basically understands all scientific knowledge as individual facts maneuvered inside of larger scientific paradigms, which is to say that they are ways of interpreting outside events and understandings that are reliant on surrounding other interpretations that give a person a picture of the world. Now, that might not sound that different than trying to discover an understanding of how things work, but it's actually fairly different, and it's in different and important ways. And the reason it's importantly different is because if scientific facts are maneuvered in such a way that you can only understand them by understanding the scientific vision at large, and that each one is an interpretive event that helps you filter your lived experience, that sounds a whole lot like a rhetorical vision. And from this perspective, science is a whole kind of rhetoric unto itself, and that science is just a discipline that communicates symbolically about, say, a physical world. But even the physical world is an understanding of human experience. It's an interpretation. Now, this is important because it basically means that while science may cast itself as non-rhetorical, it is rhetoric, that it in and of itself is a rhetorical pursuit, and that the individual scientific pieces are symbols, and the larger scientific communities are reflective of rhetorical visions. Now, if you're not convinced, let me give you a few, make a few persuasive arguments. One, science is clearly guided by outside ideologies. Scientists may not want to think so, but politics, sports, culture, all have an impact on the kind of science that gets done. If you want evidence of this, turn on your television and watch the drugs that try to get sold to you. Don't tell me that the #1 problem in the world is hair loss, and the second problem is erectile dysfunction, right? These sound like the ailments of rich old white men, right, who have the money to pay for leisure drugs, right? I would say that no, probably the disease that probably kills the most people is malnutrition, right? And then following malnutrition, I don't know, it's probably some silly disease that we have a cure for, like measles or something. Anyway, but it's not, it certainly isn't erectile dysfunction and balding, you know, receding hairlines. The kind of science that's getting done is impacted by the economy that surrounds it. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. Well, okay, maybe it is a bad thing, but what I am saying is that science is not as objective as it likes to think that it is, and that scientific agendas are set by other agendas. Eugenics is an excellent example. I mean, that's a science that was based off of a twisted ideology. In fact, the ideology was founded on some weird science, and then the ideology birthed some weird science of its own. And there's an example of the co-construction of a societal value with a scientific paradigm. Right, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, right? Whether or not someone is studying something is based off of whether or not they think that it's important. And in that, there's political and personal agenda setting, right? Whether or not you devote yourself to saving the world from environmental degradation. Of course, the facts that you're collecting are scientific, but the reason that you're collecting them, the impetus, the motivator, is a non-scientific one. It's not objective. Now, that's an example of outside rhetoric impacting science. A scientist might still say, okay, well, we are influenced by other rhetorics, but we are not ourselves rhetorical. Um, the argument that science is actually rhetorical has to do with scientific paradigms and the way that science actually gets done. Um, if you read about scientific revolutions, one of the most interesting things is that science, very often, any particular empirical knowledge is maneuvered inside one paradigm. And what usually happens, people like to imagine, scientists like to imagine the body of scientific knowledge growing and growing every day. It's sort of, it gets getting bigger and bigger, but that's not actually how it works. It gets bigger and bigger, and then somebody comes along and reinvents the whole thing, and they all sort of start over. And it's a lot more like social revolution than collecting of data. Now, of course, there's data collection going all along, but that data gets radically reinterpreted as new scientific paradigms get proposed. And which really suggests that the knowledge that's being collected can't actually be questioned on an individual level on its truthity or falsity. Truthity, is that a word? Truthiness? On its truth or falsity? I don't know, I'll look it up. You have to judge scientific paradigms as a whole, and that any particular piece of scientific knowledge is part of that. This is Quine, anyway, if you're into looking stuff up. Quine in Two Dogmas of Empiricism talks about how you can't actually point to a particular truth about the world, which is that daisies are yellow, and criticize that you have to understand the entire thing, that the entire scientific paradigm that surrounds it. Anyway, authority, right, science is actually a form of rhetoric, according to this understanding of science as a discipline, and that this discipline is informed by outside rhetorics, and that it is actually an ongoing interpretation of the world, and that these ideologies clash very often, and sometimes they overthrow each other, and different ways of understanding things become dominant, and others become submissive. Right, I mean, if you look at the medical technology, you can, talk to a doctor about chiropractors or something like that, and then talk to chiropractors about doctors. Here are two people who are dedicate years of their lives to studying medicine, and they want to heal people, but if you put them in the same room and buy them coffee, by the end of it they will hate each other, despite the fact that they're embarking upon the same goal, but because they are part of different rhetorical visions. If science were as objective as it likes to think, then one of them should clearly recognize that the other one is right, but that just isn't the way that it is. Anyway, arguments are a way of perpetuating agendas, and agendas exist inside this discipline, and very often they're self-serving. People want to push forward their particular scientific interpretation of the world. It's a community of humans, and so, just like any other, it is bound and determined to be discursive, locked inside this negotiative way of understanding our human condition. The authority of science still plays in here, but authority then is much more rhetorical in a lot of ways. It's based off the power of the ideologies and the different sense-making techniques that they can bring to bear, and how they actually argue with other ones. So this is, if you want to go do some other reading, Walter Fisher is a person who would support this understanding of science as a discipline, and basically that it is a narrative understanding of the world just like any other. So a few questions. Do you agree? In part one we had science as objective. Do you think that it's an objective pursuit? Or do you think, no, science is a discipline, right? Actually, it is a rhetorical pursuit, and not only can it not escape it, it is it. What do you think? One, the other, halfway in between? Put your comments below. And wait for part 3, science as speculation. It's the best one, I promise.